So let's start from your beginning. I think in the same time you were very much influenced by the music of John Coltrane in your beginning.
Yes.
And also in the same time later you were one of the first saxophone players to escape of this influence in terms of sound and in fact in every term. Could you explain what you keep from this influence now when you play, and what you try to avoid?
Well, that's a good question. As you said, I was, very, very influenced by the John Coltrane Quartet, by Coltrane's music, by McCoy and Elvin and Jimmy Garrison, and it was very powerful music for me. When I first heard Coltrane, I was bowled over by the power of the music, and the music spoke to me on many levels. It reached me on an emotional level. It reached me spiritually. It tapped a spiritual thing that I didn't know existed in me. It reached me intellectually and technically and mentally. And it was the only time I had been exposed to a kind of music that hit me on so many levels. So it was a very powerful experience. And it was through listening to the group that I decided I wanted to be a professional musician. I had always I had been playing music as a young child. I come from a musical family, and so there was always music in our house. But I didn't realize, I didn't make the decision until I really started listening and taking in the music of Coltrane that I wanted to pursue music. And so he was a tremendous influence, which I never escaped. It's part of the way I approach music has grown out of the music of Coltrane and other players, but he's the primary influence. Joe Henderson is a big influence for me. Sonny Rollins, Wayne Shorter, Stanley Tarantine, Johnny Griffin. I can name, many, many influences. I can go on and on, but probably the primary one was Coltrane. And as far as moving on from that, I think the main thing that maybe enabled me to move on was in playing a lot of different kinds of music, particularly R&B and various so-called fusion, as we call it today, fusion formats. And I think just from playing in some other kind of musical arenas or musical styles, and also from just playing a lot, eventually your own personality comes out. I did a tremendous amount of playing over the past few years in a lot of different areas, and practiced a lot. So eventually I think my own personality came through, but it's still tremendously Coltrane and Joe Henderson influenced, that's okay. That's a good influence,
In your disc with McCoy Quartet, you play impressions.
Yes.
And it's very, very different, in fact, from the John Coltrane Quartet version.
Yes.
Did you try to do something completely different, or it happened like that?
No, I've been playing the tune Impressions, off and on for many years. It's as a tenor saxophonist or as a saxophonist, it's a tune that we all play. It's a lot of fun to play. And I really I wasn't thinking in terms of making a bold musical statement or trying to do something different. I was, if anything, trying to just carry on in kind of the same tradition, but maybe lend my own personality to it, and just let it naturally happen. We ended up playing the tune on the record, on McCoy's record Infinity. That might have been the first time we played it, or we might have played it the week before. And I just did what came natural. I listened to McCoy, I listened to the musicians that I'm playing with, and then it comes to me what to play. And of course McCoy's playing, I think, has changed quite a bit since the days of the quartet. So I just allowed it to unfold the way it was supposed to unfold. And hopefully it came out okay. We play the song every night, and I enjoy it immensely. Yeah.
You said that for you, the influence of John Coltrane was not only musical, but also spiritual, in fact.
Yes.
Could you precise your mind about that?
Yeah, I meant that Coltrane's music transcended just almost the music itself, and went into areas of a spiritual nature. You know, he wrote that he had a spiritual awakening, and I think that it affected the way he played, and it reached out to a higher level, and I had never experienced that before, and it gave music more of a purpose for me. And that's about the best way I think I could explain it right now, in terms of keeping it simple.
But do you have yourself? Do you have religious concerns as did John Coltrane, or?
Well, I have spiritual concerns. They're not really religious concerns, but they're spiritual concerns, and they're probably different than John Coltrane's. But there are, you know, it's all linked. It's all related. And as I said, his music reached me in that area, and that was and still is very powerful. It gave a lot more to the music. It gave a lot of warmth to it, and so that is a concern for me also, but probably in a different way.
You come from Philadelphia.
Yes, I come from Philadelphia.
John Coltrane
Yeah.
and McCoy Tyner
Yeah.
and quite everybody.
Yeah.
Could you explain why this city is so important in the history of jazz?
Well, we don't really know, because there was never, oddly enough, there was never a large professional music scene. In terms, there were not a lot of clubs in Philly. There were 2 or 3 clubs, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes not. But there was a tremendous kind of community spirit there that I think lent itself. Somehow it helped the music. There were a lot of musicians in Philadelphia that were willing to help you. And also the fact that it was maybe close to New York. It was a good training ground. It was close. It was 2 hours from New York, but it wasn't New York. So but it still had sort of that same kind of urban immediacy to it. There's some kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, an urban feeling. And there was a lot of playing going on. I was the next generation from McCoy, although we know a lot of the same musicians. And the gentleman that really helped me was a guy named Eric Cravat, who was a drummer, still is a drummer, who went on later to play with McCoy. It's a small world, but he was the one that exposed me to Coltrane and McCoy, and basically taught me a lot about playing. And there were a lot of jam sessions in the Philadelphia area. I used to have them at my house, also, as McCoy was talking about, and it brought back memories. And there was a real kind of community spirit among musicians in Philly. You know, you could go to a session and there would be 10 saxophone players, you know, waiting their turn. And so it was a good place to learn how to play. I have, you know, wonderful memories about Philly, and you know, I still go back there a lot and visit family and everything.
And did you see John Coltrane playing live?
I only saw him play live once. I went 3 times, but I was only successful once. I went to a club when I was too young to get in, and that didn't work. But I finally saw him eventually play. I never saw him with the quartet, but I saw him with the band that had Alice and Rashid Ali and Pharoah Sanders. That was also that was a very memorable, really unforgettable experience. Wonderful night. And that was in Philadelphia at Temple University.
And what do you think of the evolution of his music after the breakdown of the quartet?
The direction of the music?
Yes.
I thought it was very interesting. Particularly in view of the fact that it seems that Coltrane had a tremendously open mind, was willing to experiment in so many different areas, and so I remember being sad that the quartet was no longer together, but I was fascinated by where it was going, and the directions were pretty incredible. from Ascension on. It was an amazing time in music.
And what do you think of the fact that John Coltrane hired other saxophone players to play with him in a different way? And what did he try to do being that for you?
Well, I can't, obviously I can't speak for him, but I thought that it was fascinating, again, that he hired other saxophone players to play. I think he was always trying to learn. He was very interested in other approaches to the instrument and other sounds, other people played, and I think it brought out different sides in his own playing, different elements in his own playing. So he was constantly willing to experiment, and that was he set a good example. I think he was a power of example for all of us.
How could you describe in few words the technique of saxophone that John Coltrane brought by himself?
Well, I think he expanded the language of the saxophone, thousandfold. He did things harmonically and technically that hadn't been done on the instrument. He made a great departure from the saxophonists before him, and he was able to play. Had a first of all, right off the bat, his sound was very different. Had a kind of a much harder sound that sounded hard to me at first, and then as I got used to it, I just heard so much beauty in it, different set of overtones in his sound. And of course, in terms of technique, he was really flawless, but in a very natural way. He had the ability to play tremendously fast, but it wasn't. The idea wasn't to play fast. It was more for a color that he was able to attain from playing fast. It was not playing fast to play fast, but there was by grouping notes together very quickly, he was able to achieve a color that really had not been done, and coupling that with his writing, with the talents of the great musicians in his band, and the fact that he was always reaching and searching for new things, both on the instrument and harmonically, the effect was quite devastatingly powerful. So he made a great departure, I think. Interestingly enough, even when you go back and listen, there's some bootleg tapes that I've heard of very early Coltrane. He had his own sound, even going way back. He was at the time much more Dexter Gordon kind of influenced player. Talking about 1952, 53, but you could still hear that personality that was quite unique to himself.
You know that in his last years, John Coltrane tried to experiment some electronics with a baritone and.
No, I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. But I'm not surprised.
Do you think that if he would have survived until now, he would experiment electronics?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think again he had a very open mind and was willing to try anything to learn just for the sake of learning it, and if it made a musical statement, so yes, it's highly possible that he would have pursued things in electronics. I think he would have been interested in it.
If you had to mention maybe the 4 or 5 most important recordings of John Coltrane in terms, not only in terms of music in general, but in terms of saxophone playing, which record would you?
Which 5? Well, I'd have to think about it for a second, but obviously, right off the bat, I'd have to say Blue Train, then maybe Giant Steps, then I would say Crescent, Love Supreme, and I could throw in 10 more easily. You might want to also add Kind of Blue, which was it's a Miles record, but it had I think John made a real statement on that album. Of course, many other Miles albums as well. And let me think. Probably Live at the Vanguard, you know, one of those albums. And there, Live at Birdland was a tremendously influential record for me. That was my first Coltrane record, was Live at Birdland. I was talking about it with McCoy the other day. And, you know, again, it was, I had the good fortune of being able to buy, I was listening to music at that time, so I was buying the records when they were coming out. I was young, but it was tremendously exciting. I remember when Love Supreme came out, when it was released, and going to the record store and buying it and taking it home. And how much I loved those records, and then I would look forward to the next release, you know, to see what John was going to do next, you know. So that was I have a lot of wonderful memories about that, and you know, that influence will always, that's part of my playing. I mean, it's a large part, very large part. I could never hope to attain anything like that. That was you know, John was a genius, and it was he was one of a kind. But he was such a great power of example for those of us that you know, try and make music our livelihoods. He set a good example for us, you know.
When you are not playing with McCoy, do you ask him questions about Coltrane? And
I do, and I'm very interested to hear his interviews too. We talk about Coltrane quite a bit, and McCoy is very generous about sharing his memories and his knowledge, and he's, you know, shared with me some fascinating stories, and I value, it's very valuable for me, because I didn't know John Coltrane. So, and it's been such an honor and a pleasure, and a kind of a dream come true to play with McCoy. You know, that you know, this is an experience this year that I'll have, you know, I'll never forget. You know, and hopefully we'll be able to off and on to continue this.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You are free now.
Free at last. Thanks.